My name is Bill DeSeta. I own a company called DeSeta Studios, which is a design company, but I also write a weekly blog. It's a political blog called urbancurmudgeon.com, and I've been writing that for about 11 years. So you can get that, just go online and Urban Curmudgeon, and you'll get it.
Great. And we'll include the link to that in our follow-up email to all of you. Okay. Because I've had the privilege of reading it now that we've met a little bit, Bill. So thank you for cluing me in. Okay. So we're just going to have a really great conversation. Bill has a wonderful history with the village. We've been chatting about it this evening, and I'm so excited to share it with all of you. So, Bill, let's start with when you were first coming into the village. I understand the 8th Street Bookshop is kind of where you got started. Can you tell us about how you even got that position, how you got that job?
I was like all high school kids in the 50s. It was in 1957. It was right after my junior year in high school. And like most kids, I had a summer job in Jersey near where I lived. And I lived in Englewood. And it was a factory in Englewood. And they had an accident at the factory, and the factory closed immediately. A guy got killed. So I came into the city looking for a job. And where everybody in those days who was Jewish or Italian looked for a job was in the garment center, and they had no jobs. I don't know if it was the wrong season or what it was, but I came in and looked around, and nobody was the least bit interested in hiring me. So at the end of the day, I got on a train. I had never been to the village. I got on a train and came down to see it. And I wandered into the 8th Street Bookshop, among other places, but I ended up in the 8th Street Bookshop, and I loved bookshops. I'm a book fanatic. I've been a book fanatic since I was 5 years old. I love to read. And I was in it, and I was fascinated in the 8th Street because 8th Street had something I hadn't seen a lot of, which in those days were trade paper books.
Oh, wow.
They were like a paperback book, but bigger than pocket books. Most people know what they are. And they were very involved in the new writers, the 8th Street Bookshop, and stocking. And they stocked all the beat guys and all of the new writers and poets and things you didn't find in regular bookshops in Englewood, New Jersey. So I was sitting there going through the books, and the guy behind the register ran a $20 gypsum scam, they called it. It had to do, I'm not sure how it works, but it has to do with cheating a guy out of his change with a $20 bill. Oh. And Eli Willig, the guy who owned the 8th Street Bookshop, saw him. I didn't know who Eli was, but I saw him see this guy, walk up to the register, take the money out of the guy's hands and say, "You're fired." The guy left. I went back to looking at the book that was in my hand, and then I got fascinated. Eli was then counting the register to see what was in the register, because he had to close out the register. You always have to do it when you change cashiers. And I'm standing there staring at him. He looks at him. He says, "What do you want?" I said, "You fired that guy, huh?" He said, "What business is it of yours?" I said, "Well, I'm looking for a job." And he said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, I'm looking for a job." He said, "What do you do now?" I said, "I go to school." He said, "Where do you go?" I said, "Columbia." He said, "What are you studying?" I said, "Literature." So we started talking, and he hired me. Now I was a junior in high school, Catholic high school. I didn't know anything about Columbia or literature, but he hired me. And that's how I got started in the village. It was a great job. All the guys, all the writers used to come in because it was like a Home Depot of books in those days. And they would all come in to check on their sales. It's something that I have discovered that writers do at certain bookstores. And they would do it at 8th Street. And I got to meet most of the guys who were involved in the beat scene. I got to be not very good. I got to be friends with Gregory Corso and Allen Ginsberg, and through them, I got to be friends with a lot of other guys and women who were in that scene. And I got to meet E.E. Cummings.
Oh, wow.
E.E. Cummings lived around the corner on Milligan Place, which is a little alley right off 6th Avenue. And he would come in just because he liked to read. He would come in and browse the books every couple of days. And I had just read one of his poems from one of his books off the shelf when he came in one day, and somebody said to me, "I know you like him." And I was like, so I went up to him and I introduced myself. I said, "I just read, I can't remember the poem now, but he was he liked that. Somebody was reading his stuff, and we talked a little bit. We never got to be friends really, but we got to be acquaintances. He would come in and say hello and ask me what I was doing now, and I would ask him what he was writing, and that's about as far as it went. But it was nice to know a real live published poet. I had never met a published poet before. Something that high school kids from Catholic schools don't often do. And from there, I at the end of the summer, I went back to school. I had to finish my senior year in high school. And whereas I would drop into the Eighth Street Bookshop all the time, and actually, I worked in the neighborhood for years after that, many years after that, in different jobs. I never worked at the bookshop again. I would commute back and forth to Jersey every day on a motorcycle that had belonged to my cousin. He went to the Coast Guard and gave it to me.
Wow.
And I'd park it at McDougal Alley. And the people at McDougal, I found a couple of years later, I was working at a theater, and an actor who I was working with lived in McDougal Alley, and at the time. And he said that everybody in the alley thought that the motorcycle belonged to somebody else who lived in the alley, so nobody complained about it. But it was mine, and it was very nice. It was a really easy place to leave it. It was safe.
Great. So the Eighth Street Bookshop, and I think that's so. When you think of the Village in the 50s and the 60s, you think of those moments where someone could be working at a bookshop and meet E. Cummings, like that. To hear that really happened almost sounds fairy tale like.
Yeah.
And then you worked a little bit in theater, which was kind of your entree into also the bitter end. Do you want to talk a little bit about that work?
Okay. My principal work when I got out of school in 1961 was as I just finished graduate school in 1961. I was working in theater. I had been working in theater the other summers after the summer at the Eighth Street Bookshop as a stage manager, as a carpenter, as an assistant to the designer, and later on as a producer and director. And I had done a show with a guy named Peter Bogdanovich, who became a very well-known movie director later on. But I had done an off-Broadway show with him that flopped. And I met a guy named Mike Grandman on the show, who was the production manager. And we became kind of friends. And I got a call from Mike a couple of months later saying he would like to talk to me about producing a show off-Broadway. It turned out that Mike, who had money connections, the money connections needed somebody who had background as a producer. And Mike hadn't gotten that far yet. He was just the production manager. So he asked me to join him, to go partners with him in a show, an off-Broadway show that would be directed by Elaine May, called The Third Year at the Premise. We were doing it at the Premise Theater on McDougal Street, on Bleecker Street and Thompson, and right across the street from the gate. And it was an improvisational show, 5 actors: Peter Boyle, Louise Lasser, Mark Gordon, Renee Santoni, and Renee Taylor. And we went into production, and we had problems. I had problems with the way the show was going. And Mike asked me to not cause problems, but to go someplace else until the show opened. And I said, okay, it was not a big deal. I went out to Chicago and ran a Melody Top Tents out there for the summer. Yeah. And I came back, and it turned out that Mike sold out his share of the show just before we opened to a guy who it turned out was an old friend of mine named Murray Roman. So I was perfectly happy with that. I came back, and we continued to run the show, but it had run its course pretty much. Now, Murray was friends with a guy named Fred Weintraub. and Fred Weintraub owned the Bitter End. We went out to dinner one night, and I met Fred, and we were talking this and that and the other thing. And I found out that Fred had produced a show called Go Go Loves Me, an off-Broadway musical. And in the course of the evenings talking about it, Fred let it slip that it cost him 40 grand. And I said, I saw the show. It couldn't have cost 40 grand. It's because I have a big mouth. And Fred got a little annoyed and started protecting his investment or protecting the show. And I said to him, it couldn't have been. You couldn't have spent that much money unless somebody stole from you. And it was like nobody ever stole from Fred. So it turned out he showed me the books one day, and I showed him where he'd been about 18 and the 40 grand had been stolen. And 2 days later, he called me up and asked me if I wanted to run the Bitter End for him. He said, you're out of work. I said, well, I'm always out of work. I'm in the theater. I'm in the theater. Everybody's out of work. That's not a big deal. But and nothing came up in the next couple of days. And I was intrigued by the fact that this guy had never worked in a club. And so I said, okay. I finally took the job. And it was in, I guess, October or November of 1964 that I started running the Bitter End for Fred. And it was an interesting experience for me because it was a village coffee house. And my association with clubs was very chic, hip rooms uptown that were very sophisticated. And, everybody wore suits and the Bitter End was everybody wore dungarees if they wore anything. So it was a much different scene down there than it was uptown.
Yeah.
For the clubs up there.
So what was that like? Like, what would, obviously less chic and things, but what were some of the other differances you would say once you were getting into the Bitter End that you had to get used to?
The money for starters.
The money for starters.
Yeah. You didn't make it. There was nothing like the money that the big rooms uptown worked with. But the talent was different. You had the Bitter End. We did two or three shows a night, and each show consisted of an opening act, a singer, usually a folk singer, a comic, and a featured act, which was singers 90% of the time too, but singers who had some following.
Okay.
And a singer that had following could guarantee that the house would sell out on the weekends or come close to it.
Yeah.
And do about 50% during the week.
Okay.
And you'd only do sometimes one and a half shows during the week, or two shows.
Yeah, yeah.
On the weekend, you'd do 3 shows and you'd sell them out. And that's where you made your money.
Okay.
We charged an admission.
Okay.
And we had a 1 item of food minimum.
Okay.
Now, that meant we didn't serve any food. We had a refrigerator in the kitchen that had a hamburger in it that was there when I got there and was there
when you left.
When I left 6 or 7 years later. But we did serve ice cream concoctions and things like that at outrageous prices. We had big ice cream, fancy ice cream sundaes. I don't know if any of your audience remembers, but there used to be a place called Jan's around. Yeah. Which was an ice cream parlor that did these incredible ice creams. We did stuff like that. Stuff like that to the audience.
Interesting. I would not have known that when I think of the Bitter End, thinking of ice cream.
Yeah, and coffees, various kinds of coffee. The things that Starbucks ended up with 30 years later.
Yeah.
We were doing them in the 60s.
That's great.
But it was a fun place to work, and I know that I walked. It was interesting because I walked in, and the waitress situation was a disaster.
Oh, okay.
And it was a thing that, without having run a club, I recognized bad waitressing because I ate in restaurants.
Yeah.
So I for about a month I let it kind of run the way it was running. They weren't getting all the customers. We used to lose a lot of money that way if they didn't cover the room. So I called all the waitresses together one night and I said, okay, Annie, Ronnie, and Judy, everybody else is fired.
Oh, yeah.
And they all went away very angry, and they had lots to say about me, which is to be expected. So I explained to the 3 girls that I kept that from now on, they had to cover the entire room, or I would get somebody else who could. And I told them that they all looked like slobs. And so I was going to make them all wear black leotards and a little red skirt with change purse in it and stuff like that. And they were very upset about that because I said I'd buy them, I'd pay for them.
Yeah.
Pay for them. But guys are going to be making passes and guys are going to be a problem. I said, yeah, but you look terrible. I'd like you to look nice. I'd like the place to look a little better. The place already looked like a dump, so it was not a problem. That was part of the charm of the bitter end, was that it looked like a dump.
Yeah. So
we did that and
kind of professionalized the space a little bit.
Yeah, and they did. They were wonderful. The 3 waitresses, and they were there the whole time that I worked the club. These 3 girls. Yeah. I had to add other girls occasionally, and I had other ones that came in. But their names were Judy Hetley, Annie Linden, and Ronnie Jennifer. And they were the best waitresses. But see, they made a lot of money for being the best waitresses. They were. They knew. They used to come and tell me that they made more money in 4 days than any other waitress in the village in 7.
Yeah.
Because they covered everybody and they got big tips.
Yeah.
The leotards, well, they could be a problem.
Yeah.
And once that I remember, they were. But I told them, get high neck. Don't get low cut. Because that's where the problem is going to be. And it turned out I had a girl named Erica Asher who worked for me there, who was a good waitress. She's a very short girl with very, very filled out. She was very soft. And she always wore the lowest possible. And one night she came to me and she said, guy over there at the table and I'm waiting, stuck his hand down my cleavage.
Yeah.
I said to her, what did he order? She said, he ordered a super. Why did he order I said, just tell me. She said, he ordered a super duper for 2, which was a Sunday about this long with all kinds of crap on it. And I said, okay, when you bring it to him, dump it in his lap.
Okay.
And she said to me, you kidding? I said, no, dump it in his lap. He's going to complain. Tell him to come see me.
Yeah. So
that happened. She dumped it in his lap. He came to see me and he said to me, look at that. I said, wait a minute. I said, what did you do to deserve that? And he said, well, I said, never mind. I said, I know what you did. I'm not going to debate it with you. He said to me, I could punch them. I said, no, you don't want to even talk that way. I said, look back there. And the door to the kitchen, which was a very small door, was smaller than regular doors. So appeared this giant black man. He was about 6'5" and he weighed about 270, and he completely filled the door. I said, you're not going to have a problem with me. You're going to have a problem with him.
With the staff who's going to have
just
a
that
problem.
guy. Just that one guy. It's a problem you're not going to be able to solve. I said, so let's not get into a big thing about being macho and all that stuff. I said, you're going to leave now. I got your check, but you're going to leave. I said, and he realized that he was in a situation. You have a great advantage in those situations. Clubs are intimidating to most people, and they aren't going to really.
Well, you'd have to handle all different types of situations, and then have staff who are appreciative enough to stay around for 5 years.
Well, he was getting hired for that.
Yeah.
Chuck, the guy who worked for me in the kitchen.
Yeah.
He made the Sundays and he stood in the door and be intimidating.
It was a team effort.
Yeah.
And so then what were some of the differences between that coffee house scene? And you had mentioned there were other types of houses and scenes.
Basket houses?
The basket houses,
Okay, so there were 7 functional clubs that had good talent, that you would pay to get in, and that would guarantee you a pretty good show or a great show in some cases. And then there were a lot of basket houses, which were little rooms where young talent could get started, but they didn't audition people for them or anything like that. They just lined up and signed in. So you could get I found Richie Havens in one.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay. Or you could get somebody who didn't know how to play the guitar. So you just went in, you sat down, you didn't pay to get in. You just went in and sat down, and they passed the basket.
Yeah.
If you liked him, you gave him some money, and if you didn't like him, you ignored it. That was really the only difference between the big houses and the paying at the door and the other thing.
And the curation. And I thought it was interesting you mentioned you started scouting in a way that hadn't been done before for the bitter end.
Yeah, because nobody cared enough in those. Nobody ever thought of these businesses that were going to be permanent.
Yeah.
So they didn't. So I used to like going out and seeing if I could find somebody who would be my opening act the next week. And I used to do. Richie and I ended up running a game with each other. I would see Richie either at a basket house or at the Hoot. We had a Hoot on Mondays.
Okay.
The club was closed except for the Hoot. We didn't have a regular show. And
could you tell, because I know what that is. What's a Hoot?
A Hoot
for those who might not know.
Okay, it's a Hoot Nanny. It's called the Hoot Nanny, and it's a show. It's an amateur show, basically. Is what it is. And people come in and they sign up. And we don't audition them. We did in the beginning. We ended up auditioning because some people we really couldn't put on, and I didn't want to carry a hook.
Yeah.
So we would have the Hoot Nanny, and pick out people. And Richie played our Hoot Nanny almost every week in the beginning when he was just starting out, and he was terrific. I loved him. I thought he was the best thing around. And I would hire him for the next week's opening act, and he wouldn't show up. And I'd go looking, and he'd be in some basket house down the block. And I'd go, Richie, I hired you to come for money, real money, like green money. And he would be, yeah, Bill, but I don't want to do that. That's all organized, and I got to be at time, and I got to play certain stuff. And this way I do what I want, man. And I'd talk him into coming the next week, and we do the same routine. He wouldn't show up. I'd go looking for him.
Yeah,
I knew where he was playing. We reached the houses that he liked to play at. But he never ended up playing a week's worth of work at the
that's so funny.
Never.
But I think that's so interesting because now, there's whole master's degree programs on curation.
Yeah.
And you just knew to do that, to go out and see what
came
the
out
new
of theater,
talent is.
so you were always auditioning in theater. And that was
sense.
just part of the background,
Yeah, but I think that's great, and that I'm sure a lot of people got really great opportunities because of that. Someone asked in the chat the 7 other clubs. Could you name some of the other clubs?
Yeah, there was on and where we were on Bleecker Street by Thompson, between Thompson and West Broadway. There were 3 clubs. There was Bitter End. There was the Cafe Au Go-Go that Howie Solomon owned. There was the Village Gate that Arthur Lugoff owned. Then we went around the corner to McDougal Street, and there was the Cafe War that Manny Roth owned. There was the can't think of it. And there was the Night Owl, the Joe Mauer.
Yeah.
Okay. And then a couple of blocks away, there was Folk City, Gertie's Folk City, that John Porco owned. So those are the 7 houses. So what did I say? The one. It's funny, Dave Van Ronk's place.
Oh yeah, I can't think of it off the top of my head.
He didn't own it. That was an interesting situation because that was owned by Sam Hood and his partner, and they owned the Figaro, which was a place to sit around and eat and schmooze. They had owned originally the Fat Black Pussycat Cafe. Yeah. Which I built in, I don't know.
Oh wow!
50.
That's on our West Village Rock tour. That's
no, that's a different place than one that's there now.
No, I know it's a different place.
It's in a different location.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's funny because we went down. Nano and I, my wife and I, went to see a play at the theater there, the one that's right over the Cafe War.
Okay, yeah.
And we came out and went around the corner to go to 6th Avenue, walk down 3rd Street. and there was a Fat Black Pussycat and an underground on 3rd Street. Now, there had always been both of them back in the 60s, but they weren't.
It wasn't there.
No, the underground was under the WA next door, and under a place that I owned called the Thieves Market. And the Fat Black Pussycat was on McDougal Street. That ran from McDougal to Minetta Lane. Yeah. And with big windows on the Minetta Lane. And that became the Fiend John eventually. Oh, okay. Which was Manny Dwarman's room. It was started out mostly as a restaurant, but then he started booking in talent and had the shows. And he had Middle Eastern talent because he had Middle Eastern food. The Fiend John was definitely a Middle Eastern restaurant. Interesting. And he had people like Beulah Gill, who was a wonderful Israeli singer, who played the Fiend John. But Van Ronk is an interesting guy. I liked the way he played. I liked the way he performed. And I used to always try to book him into the bitter end. And he wouldn't play the bitter end. Oh, wow. Bitter end's a sellout, Bill. All about is money. They aren't interested in the real folk music. The audiences really weren't. Well, and he was at Gertie's all the time, right? They were at Gertie's, so they were at the Gaslight. Oh, thank you. Yes. They were at the Gaslight. That's what he was. Hood and Mitchell, John Mitchell and Sam Hood owned it, but Ran it. He was a performer there, but he actually ran the place. Yeah, and his one of his album covers is on the steps, right? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. And then you talked a little bit with me about how there was just kind of a different ethos at these different places. So you were just saying, like, there's the folk city sort of ethos, the end ethos, Cafe Wah, what was that like? Actually, there was very different. The Bitter End was a commercial club. It had really good talent most of the time. I mean, really good talent some of the time. Yeah. Well, you were curating it to be that way. Yeah. But I mean, guys like Cosby and Woody with the comics. Yeah. And, you'd have the Serendipity Singers who were big time commercial act. The women folk who were the best act I ever saw. Oh, wow. 5 girls who were fantastic. And they never made it. I don't understand why they didn't. Yeah. And we managed them. So interesting. Then there was the Gate, which was a big commercial operation. They had a theater in the basement. They had 2 performing rooms upstairs, a big one and a small one. They did a lot of jazz. Yeah. They did some folk, but it was commercial folk. It wasn't folk. It wasn't Woody Guthrie folk. Yeah. It was Joan Baez folk. And then the Wah, which Manny Roth owned, was kind of down and dirty, whatever they could get away with. Yeah. Manny didn't much care. He just enjoyed having the room. Yeah. And then Gertie's was a real folk scene. I mean, they were the Woody Guthrie folk. Yeah. And so was the Gaslight. The Go-Go, Howie never figured out what the room was. Howie Solomon owned the Go-Go, and he would book in whoever he thought had been in the papers that week. Okay. Or last week. I mean, he did stuff like literally he booked comic. Honey, who was the comic?
Lenny Bruce.
Huh? Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce. He booked in Lenny Bruce when Lenny was on trial. Wow. And it broke him. Yeah. Lenny would come in every night and read the transcript from the trial instead of doing an act. Yeah. And people didn't know he was going to do that, so he packed the club. And he had to give all the money back because they were walking out in droves. And he still had to pay to run the club. So when Lenny left, Howie Howie came to Fred to get a loan.
Mm-hmm.
And Fred said to me, why don't we buy the club from you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I said, Howie, we'll buy the club from you.
Yeah.
What are you in debt?
Yeah.
He said he was in debt 80 grand.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, okay, we'll give you 80 grand for the club.
Mm-hmm.
We'll bail you out. You'll walk away free. He said, no. I said, I can't walk away without a profit.
Yeah.
So we handled back and forth. By that time, I had opened the Tin Angel next to the bitter end. And we were sitting up there arguing. And Howie got ticked off and walked away. And the next week, he booked in Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Whoa!
And they tore the roof off the place.
Yeah.
And it was just, he went on to tremendous success.
Yeah.
After Blood, Sweat, and Tears, he booked in Chicago, and they did the same thing.
Oh my goodness!
And it was really a terrific time for him. He did very, very well.
Wow, good thing he bartered a little bit. I guess.
For him it was. I would have because I wouldn't have booked in Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Yeah.
You know, but that's the way. It's kind of the way it worked. And the Village was for weird people in those days too.
Yeah, all different types. And let's talk about your photography for a little bit, because you did a lot of photography, and I think that's interesting, the kind of mix between the business side, where you were the manager making all these shrewd business moves, but then also you're an artist yourself with your photography.
Well, I had done the show that I mentioned before, that I had done, the Peter Bogdanovich show. There was a guy named Tony Kent in the show who was an actor, but also a struggling photographer. And we were friends, and we used to shoot pool together.
Yeah.
There was a pool parlor at the corner of 79th and Broadway, on top of a Five and Dime store.
Okay.
And we used to go over there and shoot pool. And he was a wonderful pool. He was a shark.
Yeah.
And I was just an average guy. And we used to hustle.
Yeah.
And we made more doing that than we did work. Yeah. But he was a really good photographer, and he kind of got me interested in photography and and so I did some stuff. I started doing reportage. There was a place on 40th Street between 6th and 7th that bought pictures of stuff late at night that happened in the city.
Okay,
and then sold them to the papers. And you bring your stuff. Tony showed me that you bring your stuff there. And they would develop it for you.
Yeah.
And if they wanted something, they'd call you and say, "We want this. We'll give you this for it." And if they didn't, they just throw it away.
Yeah. Wow.
And whether you wanted it or not. Yeah. It's the way it was.
Yeah.
So I did that for a while. I took a lot of pictures, and I sold a couple, not many.
It's very Spider-Man. It's giving me Spider, because isn't that how he started too with his photography, selling it to papers?
So when I got down to the bitter end, I was still shooting, and I shot. We had guys that we managed. We had a guy named Jake Holmes and a couple of other people, and they needed publicity shots to go out in front of the club. So I took publicity shots for them, and then I took publicity shots for other people. Yeah. And it kind of steamrolled.
Yeah. Oh, you need a photographer? Bill's really good. That's usually how that happens.
And I took some album covers, and I eventually started shooting nudes, and I decided to do a book of them. And that's kind of, I got into that. I mean, I never made a lot of money like you should as a photographer doing, but I made enough. It was a good sideline, and it didn't take away from my running the club at all.
Did it give you a different kind of relationship with, did you get to know the musicians differently, or you already had that relationship and that's why they came to you?
The relationship, and that's why I got to take the pictures.
They trusted you. I mean, it's very interesting as an artist, like the connection between photographers and the artists they're taking photographs of. I think there needs to be trust. So that's interesting that maybe in your role there that you built that kind of trust. Any other favorite stories you have from the bitter end or otherwise that you want to share?
Okay, Manny. First of all, I should mention Manny Roth, who owned the wall, had owned the bitter end first.
Oh, interesting.
It was called the Cock and Bull, and that's who Fred bought the club from.
Okay,
he bought it from Manny. Manny had a guy working for him at the wall later on, named Mark Sloan, who was a very funny, very interesting guy. He was the assistant manager. And one day, Mark found someplace a cardboard card with buttons on it that said "fuck hate."
Oh, wow.
And he brought them out into Washington Square.
Yeah.
And in 15 minutes, he sold 100 buttons.
Whoa!
And he realized that there was a business here.
Yeah.
And Mark became the Button King.
Oh.
He opened up, eventually had 6 stores in the village and in the East Village selling buttons.
Wow.
And he made a fortune. He became very rich.
How interesting. I was going to ask about like Washington Square Park, how that kind of played into your...
Well, I enjoyed Washington. I used to play a lot of chess in Washington Square Park. I thought of myself as a chess hustler, but I wasn't that good.
Yeah.
Not even close to being that good. We'd go in, we'd hang out there. Not a lot. It was really mostly for people who were tourists who were coming in.
Yeah.
Even people came in from Long Island.
Yeah.
And the kids all played there, and you rarely found a musician playing there who was.
They were going to Gertie's or something.
Yeah.
Instead.
So what it did was it brought a lot of action to the village.
Oh, okay. So it was a destination, so then they'd go to the clubs and things after that?
They would come and hang out there, then they'd go to the clubs in the early evening and night. And the demonstrations would start there and move into the streets, which was always became a problem later on in 60, 67, 68. And there was a lot they closed off Bleecker, they closed off McDougal. They had the TPF there, the horse TPF. And they were a problem because they were completely out of control.
Yeah.
They made today's dangerous cops look like children.
Yeah.
Because they were on horseback with clubs and they had no compunctions.
Yeah, we didn't have video cameras in our phones to capture what was going on. Yeah.
So they were a big problem.
Yeah.
But,
and then someone asked about the improv scene at the premise. Do you have any familiarity, or maybe they just meant the comics? Let's see.
No, okay. No, the Improv was a club uptown on 44th Street 9th. It was owned by a buddy of mine. And what we would do is they would all the same comics played every place. There wasn't like that as a million comic clubs. There were no comic clubs in those days. And the Improv, Bud Friedman owned it, along with his wife, Silva. And he had opened it as a place for singers who were in the choruses of Broadway shows.
Interesting.
To come in and sing at night.
Yeah.
And he realized that was with a lot of these singers were great singers, and they just didn't get any place yet. And so he had terrific entertainment up there. And when I closed the bitter end, I would go up there. My roommate at the time, because I wasn't married yet, my roommate was the MC at the Improv. His name was Jack Knight. But he was also the doorman at the bitter end.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Jack Knight was the best looking straight guy in New York City. And every woman who ever saw him chased him.
That's who you want at your door, right?
That's right. That's exactly why he was at the door.
Yeah.
And he also had a line of blarney that was so he was great at that. But yeah, the Improv was a great place to develop comics. It was the original comic room because it just transitioned from singers somehow to comics. And there was all the terrific comics of the 70s, I'm sure, worked at the Improv at one point. They didn't get paid. They would work there for nothing. Bud had a fantastic deal. He was selling drinks left and right and not paying anybody any money there for the entertainment. But Bud eventually moved out to California and opened a chain. They had a chain of Improvs all around the country.
Yeah.
and he had a big one on Santa Monica Boulevard in California, which Jack, my roommate, eventually moved to California and was the host of the improv out there.
Wow, that's amazing.
But it was a terrific scene. But it went till 5 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't like the bit of we would close one unless we were doing 3 full shows. We would be out of there by 1 o'clock.
Oh wow, yeah. And then so you would go uptown? Would people like go to other clubs in the village or coffee houses or what?
Well, we didn't. There was nothing for me in the coffee houses. So we would just go uptown to the clubs. And mostly to the 90%, 99% to the improv, or to a couple of bars that we had as part of the theater community before the village scene. There were bars in Midtown that I frequented. Ralph's, the theater bar, both on 47th Street. But they were all in the theater district, the bars up there, Downey's. Joe Allen's, places like that.
And I think that's so interesting when you think about just like you were just living your life and going to those places, but now those are names. And same thing, like my sister asked me, where should I get a drink before a show coming up? And I was like, Joe Allen. So it's just so funny that it's still, it's still there and it's still the same place where artists will go hang out.
Well, Joe died last year.
Oh, that's too bad. Yeah. So that I think it's important to have these conversations and remember these sorts of things. Before we get too late on time, I want to see if we have any questions from the audience. Were there poetry readings at these clubs, or is that more the 1950s beatniks? So you talked a little bit about the beatniks, but how did that interact with places like the Bitter End?
That was strictly 50s beatnik stuff. And the biggest place, the hottest place for that kind of thing that I recall was the Metro, which was really in the East Village, or on the border of the East Village. It was over on 10th Street and 2nd Avenue by St. Mark's. But that was really a hot club for poetry readings, and I don't know how many of them I saw there. I used to shoot the guys there and the women, and it was really the Metro was the hottest place around for that kind of thing. And they also did shows there. I directed an off-Broadway show there once. They did no dance, but it was they did small shows occasionally with small casts and a lot of poetry readings. And sometimes they would book a singer in. But I remember them mostly as the place where poetry was read. There was also there was a place on McDougal Street about a block up from the Provincetown Playhouse, which would make it around 4th Street. It was down in the basement of the building. If you walk along the street, they had windows that were kind of half above the sidewalk, and you could look down, and it was furnished with sofas and easy chairs.
Oh, wow.
And they used to have poetry readings down there, and I don't remember the name of it. But it was like right around 4th Street. The building is still there.
Still there.
It's now owned by NYU, I'm sure. Everything over there is.
And then someone asked, was this also the era of the Dom on St. Mark's?
The Dom came along at the end of the era. The Dom came, I guess it started in the late 60s, but it was really prominent in the 70s. Mickey Ruskin, who had owned the Ninth Circle, opened the place on Park Avenue and 17th Street called Max's Kansas City. And that kind of opened an era over there that was the Dom, and there was a couple of other Polish halls that did the same thing. The Dom was a hot room, and it was very successful, and it made a lot of money, I'm sure, for the guys who owned it. I didn't know them. I was there a couple of times, just because people were going, and I went with them. But it was a very successful room. It was not my scene at all. By the time the Dom came into play, I was married, and we had a child on the way. But it was a good room.
Yeah.
I was there a couple of times, and I thought it looked like fun. I didn't like the music that they played there. Interestingly enough, even though I ran a folk club, I was not a folk fan. I'm a jazz and Broadway show tune type of person. That's what I like to listen to.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's so interesting, just thinking about living history and how all these interactions, like the shows you end up going to because a friend performed versus the places that you might have missed, but you heard about it and it was great. I think that's great. And this is my last call for questions to the audience. If you want to get any other questions, someone asked for the years you were at the bitter end. What years were you there?
I started in the fall of 54, and I left. Well, what happened was I opened the Tin Angel next door and upstairs from the bitter end. And that was in 58. And so I was still running the bitter end, but I had an assistant manager doing it for me, really. And then I left the Tin Angel in, 58, 68. And I left the Tin Angel in 70 because I hated the restaurant business and didn't have the personality to say to somebody who didn't like the dinner, well, I'm sorry, we can fix something.
Yeah.
I used to say to them, I got the check, don't come back.
Yeah.
Which is not the way to run a restaurant, by the way. And then when I sold the tent, and I sold out to Fred. Fred and I opened the Tin Angel together, and I sold out to him in 70, I guess, and opened, or 69, and opened the Thieves Market with Manny Roth around the corner next to the wall, which was a flea market that people. I rented out space to people who were making crafts.
Oh, great!
Buying posters, and I had a poster myself called the Nude Peace Symbol, and that was a very big seller.
Yeah.
And I pushed them. But it was those are the dates pretty much.
Yeah,
I had the Thieves Market for a couple of years. Fred and I opened the Tin Angel because every time we sat down for dinner, most of the time when you had dinner down in that neighborhood, you either ate at the Figaro, or at the Minetta Tavern, or at the Fiend John, or the San Remo. Those are the places that I ate. And the spaghetti joint on 6th Avenue. Emilio's. Yes, Emilio's. Great big plate of spaghetti, buck and a quarter.
Yeah. You could run
if you wanted extra meatballs, it was another quarter, and a Coke was a dime.
Yeah,
couldn't beat it. But every time I went out to dinner and sat down, it was halfway through the meal, somebody from the club would come running up to the table and, Bill, you got to come, we got to find you.
Yeah.
And that was the end of your dinner. So one day Fred said to me, we should really open a restaurant so we have someplace to eat.
Yeah, and you don't have to run away from your meal.
That's right. He said there's a spot over the dugout. The dugout was just east of the bitter end. It was a bar, and we all drank in there. And upstairs had been a Korean restaurant that went out of business years before. And it had been empty ever since. So we looked at it. The same guys, same real estate company owned that, has owned the bitter. Everything in the village was owned by the mob. All the real estate.
Someone just asked a question about how the mob was involved. I wasn't sure if you wanted to get into it.
No, that's okay. Because it's all gone now. Those guys are all dead. So we rented this space for the Tin Angel, and we opened a restaurant there. The object to be the place for us to eat with our friends.
Yeah.
We had no desire to have a successful restaurant. We weren't looking for that at all.
Yeah.
We wanted to break even and have a place to eat dinner. Well, we were a restaurant owned by the guys who ran the hottest club in the village, the hottest folk club in the country, except for maybe the Hungry Eye. You couldn't get a seat in there if you were open. I couldn't get my own table. the guy who was the maitre d' would say, Bill, for Christ's sake, we got people waiting outside. You're not using the table. But I'm coming in later. No, we'll have it out. Don't, you know.
Yeah.
And we would, we had a hugely successful restaurant.
Yeah. But not what you had banked on.
Not what I was banked on, no. But it was a real restaurant, and I hadn't planned on a real restaurant. So a year in, shopping for meat at the market up in the Bronx Terminal Market at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then running a club. And it got to be, it was like, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
And I didn't like running a restaurant. I really didn't. I was not personality-wise cut out for it. So I sold out. I went to Fred and I said to him, Fred, I want to sell out. He bought me out right away because at that point the restaurant was making money hand over fist. And Manny, as soon as I sold out to Fred, Manny called me and said, you want to do this thing? What he wanted to do was he wanted to open a jazz club on McDougal Street. But the problem was you couldn't do a jazz club without a liquor license.
Yeah.
And that was going to take a year and a half to work its way through the system and rebuild the room into a nice jazz room. So we had to do something to pay for the spot in the meantime. So that's how the Thieves Market came into existence.
Interesting.
It was going to be a jazz club.
Yeah.
But by the time it got to be halfway through the system, it was a year later or a year and a half later, and I was tired of the Village.
Yeah.
I had decided I wanted to go back to theater, and so I wanted out.
Yeah.
And I just quit everything. I just told everybody I'm gone. And interestingly, nobody called me. Somebody did finally.
Yeah.
But that had to do with Paul Colby, who had his name over the bitter end.
Yeah.
And that was something that always stuck in my craw because he had this big sign on the front of the club, Paul Colby's bitter end. Paul Colby really, he certainly had the club longer than anybody else. No question. But he really had nothing to do with starting, developing, or making the club.
The name of what people knew the bitter end to be.
That's probably an interesting story. I don't know if you have time.
Yeah, we do. Let's see. We don't. Who owns and runs the bitter end now?
I don't know.
Okay, we don't know. But what we're going to talk about is one of the owners.
An ancient product. Yeah. Fred had when he bought the Cock and Bull from Manny, Fred picked up the lease with it. And it was a sweetheart lease. It was $400 a month.
Whoa, nice. Yeah.
When we opened the Tin Angel, almost 10 years later, we were paying $2,000 a month rent.
Wow.
That was the rent on the place. Those buildings and all the buildings in the area were owned by the mob. And their guy was a guy named Emil Ermelino and his son, Arthur Ermelino. They had the real estate business that took care of all the rooms. They also had an oil business that supplied oil for all the buildings. We were very good friends. So when the Tin Angel closed, it was around 71, I guess, or 72, maybe, I'm not sure. I was already gone. And Arthur Ermelino went to Fred and said, Fred, you got to pay the lease out. This isn't like renting an apartment.
Yeah.
You owe us the rest of the lease. And Fred said, there's no business. There's no money. What am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
He said, you got plenty of money, Fred. Everybody knows you got plenty of money. The club alone put that. And Fred said, no. He said, there's a different business that signed the lease. It's just the way it is. So Arthur didn't argue the point. He just said, okay. And about 7 months later, the bitter end lease was up. And Fred called Arthur and said, I want to renew the lease. And Arthur said, no, you're out. So Fred by this time was out in California producing movies very successfully. Bruce Lee stuff.
Wow.
And he did the Woodstock movie. And he was very successful as a producer. And he was too busy to worry about the bitter end. It was small change. In the meantime, when I had left the bitter end to open the Tin Angel, I had hired a guy named Dave Wilkes as my assistant. Dave ran the club. When I quit the Tin Angel, Billy Fields, who was a member of the organization and who had run the club briefly before me, had a friend named Paul Colby, and he suggested Paul to take over as manager.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul did. So Paul was actually running the bitter end when the lease ran out.
Oh.
They closed the club for a couple of months. First they changed the name to the Other End because Fred threatened to sue them if they used that name. Then Colby ran it, and then they closed completely. And Arthur called me. First he called Billy Fields, then he called me, asking both of us if we would run the club. And neither one of us wanted to. I didn't want to come back to the village at that point. Mm-hmm. So he kept Paul Colby on. Fred finally just decided he wasn't interested at all in anything that was going on and just let them do whatever they wanted. So they took the name back, mm-hmm. and then Paul put his name on top of the thing. And that's why for must be 30 years at least, it was Paul Colby's bitter end.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Because when you look through the pictures or if you were around and saw it, the sign change was always interesting.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Well, we have a couple more questions, Bill, if you're up for it.
Sure.
Let's see. Someone asked, someone said, talk about the mob. What current clubs do you think are doing a good job with talent and business, and how is the business different now, if you know?
I'm sorry, say it again?
Yep. What do you know of any current clubs you think are doing a good job with the business, or how are things different now? Or well, do you keep yourself arm's length?
As far as no issue clubs, I'm 86 years old. I don't go to clubs very often anymore. I can barely stagger upstairs to bed at night. There's always been clubs that did well, you know. The Gate is a perfect example. I don't know who owns it now. I mean, Art has been dead for years, but Manny's been dead for years, but they both are still there. And I guess is maybe the oldest existing club that's functioning down there, and it still makes money. And I don't know how the hell he does it, because he never books anybody. The guy who owns it now, and Manny didn't either. They never booked guys who were like big names or anything like that. But they managed to make a living. They managed to keep open and do well. Manny did very well with the club financially. Arthur Lugoff did great with the Gate, but that was a whole piece of real estate there. I don't know. I didn't know Mike Porco, and I didn't know how Gertie's did very well. I didn't know. I mean, they always seem to be open and functioning and booking good acts, so I always assumed they did okay. Howie, all these guys who did. I think that I'm the only one left alive of all the guys I mentioned who ran clubs. And at my age, who knows? But Howie did okay for a few years and then closed the club. I was gone by then myself, so I don't know what was going on. The Gaslighters were closed for years.
Yeah.
And Joe Mara closed the Night Owl right in the middle of its hottest, when it was a red hot club.
Yeah.
They discovered the Mamas and the Papas were discovered there, and so were another hot group that escapes me.
Spanky.
Huh?
Spanky.
No, not Spanky. We started Spanky, actually. That's an interesting story. Spanky and our gang was an act that was going to be a red hot act, and we had them in at the bitter end. And they went to a party, and the bass player started talking about he wanted to shoot Johnson.
Oh no!
And there was an FBI agent at the party.
Yeah.
He went to jail, and the group was disbanded immediately.
Oh no! So be careful where you're talking and what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Someone said the Love and Spoonful at the Night Owl.
Yeah, that was the other group.
The Love and Spoonful.
Yeah, at the Night Owl. That's right. It was a Spoonful, and yeah, the Spoonful had an interesting guy in it, Zalyanovsky, who was the bass player, who was married to Jackie Burroughs, who was a Canadian actress, who in those days was working as a waitress in most of the places. But she ended up getting nominated for an Academy Award.
Yeah. Wow.
For a movie that she did with, I forget the actor's name, but it was about an older woman. She looked much older than she really was. Jackie did. I mean, she looked like a character woman, a craggy-faced Tennessee character woman. When she was still a kid, she was still in her 20s and 30s.
Oh, wow.
But she was a very good actress. And he was a very nice guy. So
yeah. That's great. I think we have one more question. What effect, if any, did Bill Graham and the Fillmore East have on the clubs? Was that the same era?
No,
that was,
he was after. Well, they all overlapped, you know. He overlapped, but it was a completely different culture.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the clubs were folk clubs. Some of them started playing rock bands like Chicago and Blood, Sweat, and Tears at the Go-Go. We had a couple of rock acts in. They didn't work in the club because the club was too small and they hurt your ears.
Yeah.
And I hated that music.
Bad sound.
But that was a whole other scene with a whole other set of people.
Okay.
You know, I mean, the acts were different. They were too big to play the club. Bitter Ends had 216 people.
Oh wow, yeah.
You know, you couldn't bring in somebody who was really expensive because we couldn't afford them.
Yeah. And
we got a couple of people who were really expensive only because they started there and they had the loyalty to come back and play the club.
Yeah.
You know, that's what Cosby did it. Woody did it. They came back and packed the room for a weekend.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't even take paycheck.
Oh, that's
you know, they just did it because they knew that the club could use the money.
And then maybe we can end on this. You told me an interesting story about Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Okay.
And the bitter end.
All right. It's a bitter story. When Fred first took over the club from Manny, when he first changed it to the bitter end, he was the entertainment. He was a very good piano player, and he used to play piano in the room. But he realized that he needed something. The room had no appeal of any kind. I mean, there was no reason for anybody to come into the room to listen and play the piano, and the coffee wasn't that good. So what he did was he had a waitress named Mary Travers, and she had a couple of friends named Peter and Noel. And so they put together a group, and they named it Peter, Paul, and Mary. And the group played the room, and the group recorded, and got to be a very successful group at blinding speed. But Fred never signed them as an act to his management. And another guy came along called
Albert Grossman.
Albert Grossman from Chicago. He had a club in Chicago, and he came along and he signed them. And Fred never forgave them or him. And when Albert signed other people, including Bob Dylan had played the club as an opening act. But when he became a star and wanted to come back and play the bitter end, Fred wouldn't let him play it because Grossman was managing. Same with Baez. I think that she played the club as an opening act before I was there. But he wouldn't book her in. So she played the gate all the time. She was right across the street. She'd play it. Someone knows. So Albert went on to be a very successful manager.
And Peter, Paul, and Mary are household name. They're on PBS all the time, right?
Yeah, that's right. Selling records.
But I think that's fascinating. And that's like the whole point of these kinds of conversations is we know the history of where people played, for example, but there's all this rich humanness behind why people played certain places.
Yes.
And I really am grateful for you sharing this. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we close things down?
I don't know. I mean, I could sit here and talk like this.
Yeah, we could talk for days.
Another 8 hours at least, and still have stories left from the time. But I think that, in a general thing, that's about what I have to say for tonight.